So with more and more substantiated rumors of a Switch Pro or a new Nintendo Switch, I've started to mentally revisit the topic of exclusive games coming to this theoretical mid-gen hardware refresh. Last year, I would have been fully against the idea, and it's a fine line, but I'm starting to see a couple benefits of some Switch Pro exclusive games. Let's talk about it. So to catch you up to speed on what the Switch Pro is rumored to be, in short, it's what we're calling a mid-gen refresh for the Switch. It's not a Switch 2 or a Nintendo swap. It's theoretically meant to be an optional hardware upgrade while we wait for Nintendo's next generation system further down the road. I talked about that theoretical next-gen system in a video in the card linked above, but the assumption is that for the next gen, while there will be some games that'll be on the Switch and the swap or the Switch 2, the Switch games will taper off and the swap games will be the ones to remain. And that's the way it goes with all software as hardware moves forward. Except for Just Dance on the Wii, that just kept on trucking. But with the Switch Pro or the new Nintendo Switch, I'll be using both interchangeably. I think it's going to be called the new Nintendo Switch, but I guess we'll find out. We would assume it to be more like the Xbox One X or the PlayStation 4 Pro. Those were stronger pieces of hardware that run exactly the same games as the Xbox One and the PS4, respectively, but just look better and run faster and so on. So with the new Nintendo Switch, it would be reasonable to essentially expect the same. And in large part I do, but what if not entirely? When thinking of Microsoft and Sony as compared to Nintendo, correlation is not causation, for better or for worse. Nintendo isn't using the Xbox One X or the PS4 Pro as a blueprint for what they want to do. It's just coincidence at most. Instead, we actually need to look to Nintendo's own history. On last week's podcast episode, which you can check out at youtube.com/directly2, or, podcast services, look for Directly to You, AJ and I discussed Nintendo hardware revisions and the fact that it's present in every single case of Nintendo's handheld line. But if we look a bit further, we can actually see it's present on all of their most popular consoles at varying degrees. The NES and Famicom had the top-loading NES and the Famicom Disk System. The Wii had the Wii Family Edition and the Wii Mini. The Game Boy Advance, Advance SP, and Game Boy Micro. The DS, DS Lite, DSi, and DSi XL. And then the two most important to the conversation here, the Game Boy and the 3DS. I guess the point here is that Nintendo's done hardware revisions more often than they haven't. Even the N64 did have the N64DD, and the GameCube had the Panasonic Q. But by and large, the more successful the console, the more they seem to lean into this. And in terms of the Switch, it sure is successful. And as I mentioned, the 3DS and the Game Boy are really the examples to go off here. The 3DS obviously with the new 3DS, and the Game Boy because to Nintendo, the Game Boy Color is part of its same family. Both of these being examples of mid-generation revisions with exclusive games. The new 3DS only really had 18 exclusives, only a couple of which were notable, and some SNES games. But the Game Boy Color had tons of games that were fully exclusive. So this is what I mean when I say that we don't need to look at the competition for precedence, but rather at Nintendo's history. And if we look a bit further, there's even Famicom Disk System games, DSiWare, and 64DD games. But how would this look with the Switch? My main concern up to this point has been that there's 80 million Switches already out there. And if there were exclusive games, those users would either have to upgrade or not get to play the games at all. And in this day and age, that could definitely come across fairly anti-consumer, especially if there are as many exclusives as the Game Boy Color had. So what I want to think about here is what the benefits even would be for exclusive new Nintendo Switch games, if there are situations where it's actually beneficial for the customer, and how to minimize all the situations where it's not. First of all, something competitors and previous consoles haven't quite had to consider is the scaling that already has to be done with the Switch as it is. When the Xbox One X came out, developers had to start targeting the One X, S, and the base Xbox One. But now if we think about a theoretical Switch Pro, assuming it has a new, smaller, better chip that it's supposed to have, developers will need to start targeting the base model handheld mode and Switch Lite, which should be the same, the base model docked mode, and then also Switch Pro handheld and Switch Pro docked. I assume Switch Pro handheld would be a middle ground anyway, so shouldn't be that much of an issue, but that could potentially be 3 to 5 drastically different performance scenarios. And where it may not matter for less power intensive games, as you get into the upper limits of the Switch Pro, that could certainly be a challenge. There's a ceiling there that may be out of reasonable reach if the lower end of the current Switch Lite is still in consideration. And to be honest, I do expect that at some point there will be a silent revision to the current Switch and the Switch Lite as they are right now, but even if that happened tomorrow, there's more than 80 million of the old ones still out. So what is Nintendo to do? Well, one solution that we've talked about before is that for any games that are new Switch exclusive, they would just have a cloud version for the base model. Ideally, this is a situation like if you buy a Blu-ray and there's a digital code to be redeemed in it as well. Say I buy Elder Scrolls 6 for the Switch Pro. If I have a Switch Pro, I put in the cartridge or I buy it digitally and I play the game, and it's great. But on the current Switch, either of those would prompt the cloud launcher, and then I would just play on the cloud, and my save data would be saved on the console itself and backed up in the cloud, I guess. And if I ever upgrade to a Switch Pro later, it'll just become a local version at that point, and all my save data will carry over like it does with every other game. Of course, playing on the cloud in 2021 isn't ideal yet, but it's proven to be decent enough to at least be a pro-consumer band-aid in the meantime. But here's where I start to get to the part that's actually changed my tune on the topic. So yes, I do think the cloud solution is an ideal make-good for the existing user base, but the other part of the solution is to really limit which games are exclusive to the new Switch, but make them good ones. The fact is that outside of the possibility of the silent refresh that I suspect they'll eventually do, the early adopters to an upgrade like this are the core gamers that either want the best technology they can, or more likely have really invested in the Nintendo Switch ecosystem and want to see some more progress in that arena. I've seen countless polls asking if people would pay $300, $350, or $400 for a Switch Pro, and from what I've seen of those that care, the majority will pay up to $400. So this is an opportunity to make hardware with a better experience for every game, but incentivize the exact target audience that would upgrade anyway with just a couple games that truly could work only natively on an upgraded Switch. And ideally, this effort would tie into bringing back dormant franchises that have been used to show off Nintendo's power in the past. For example, F-Zero and many times has been a technical showcase, Star Fox on the SNES, Pilot Wings, Metroid Prime, and of course, Golden Sun. I would love for the reason that none of these franchises have come to the Switch yet is because they're working on extremely ambitious titles in these franchises for the Switch Pro. I've talked several times about a theoretical Star Fox game that's an open galaxy with seamless world transitions. Pilot Wings could be an amazing experience to mirror what Microsoft has done with Flight Simulator, but a bit more of an arcadey experience, but still, cool and stuff. I think F-Zero can be more than just a futuristic racer, but whatever comes out needs to still have the racing in there, and the extra hardware power could really help make that fast, frenetic, but still beautiful. And Golden Sun, looking as good as it does on the Game Boy Advance, is just absolutely insane. I'd love the next Golden Sun to be a stunning RPG. But Metroid brings us to a complication here. If there are any Switch Pro exclusive games, I think they have to be ones that haven't been announced yet at all. Of course, I'd love for Breath of the Wild 2, Metroid Prime 4, Bayonetta 3 to take advantage of the upgrade from this new hardware, but being exclusive to it, that would be a hard move. But yeah, all in all, I don't want to talk about the Switch Pro rumors just for their own sake again. At this point, I'd just like to see it come out and talk about it then. But this being different, I do find it interesting that I'm changing my tune on the exclusive game thing, because I really did think that it would be against Nintendo's best interest to have any Switch Pro exclusive games, especially if the Switch is at the end of its life cycle. But it's not. If it's at its midway point now, there's still plenty of time to build up that user base a second time or slowly migrate it over. With new hardware, it should be fairly easy to trade in your old Switch and then only have to pay like a $100, $150 upcharge for the new hardware rather than the $300, $350, or $400 for a brand new Switch Pro. So if I'm imagining the Switch timeline from a holistic view, from like the perspective of me in 2030, I could easily see this new hardware introduced sometime sometime in 2021, and the older hardware phased out sometime during 2022. And then probably 3 years of this newer hardware, and then some sunset years as the next gen comes out, with maybe a few more odd revisions during that time. To a Switch Home, perhaps, something that broadens the audience but doesn't replace anything that's already on sale. And when it's all said and done, if the Switch ends up selling 130 million units, which is entirely plausible, 100 million of those might be the current hardware, and then the other 30 million is the newer hardware. And that's plenty enough people to justify 10 or 20 first or third party Switch Pro exclusives, in my opinion. Especially if those increase brand loyalty to Nintendo and kick those franchises back into gear. Basically, I just really want to see a cool Star Fox, F-Zero, and Golden Sun. Is that too much to ask? Come on. But that's what I think. What do you think? Do you think it's likely that we'll get Switch Pro exclusive games if you think the Switch Pro is coming at all? It's still a rumor, so who even knows? And if so, do you have a different solution other than mine for the cloud gaming and stuff? Let me know all that and more in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to fanatixfour for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday, or sometimes different days. It depends on the week. Things happen. And some of those comments we'll take and talk about on our podcast, youtube.com/directlytoyou. I mentioned it earlier. Go listen to the podcast. Hey, this is to you right there. If you watch our videos but don't listen to the podcast, I mean, that's fine. You can do whatever you want. But the podcast is a whole lot of fun, and I think you would enjoy it. So give it a shot sometime. You know what I'm saying? Give it a good old go. But that's about it for me. And I guess I'm trying out this setup now. I'm also going to be editing on a different software, so we'll see how this one turns out. Fingers crossed. Let's go. All right. Well, that's it for me. Peace and blessings.